When telling a story, sometimes a writer is faced with the dilemma of what questions should and shouldn't be answered at any given time. Because if you leave too many questions unanswered, it can easily lead to story problems and leave the audience feeling wholly unsatisfied. But if you answer too many questions, you risk the story losing its appeal and that the audience won't like the answers you've presented. So today, I'd like to go over the basics of how to use ambiguity, mainly by using examples I believe used and didn't use it very well. Now, just to save you all some time, there could and probably will be spoilers ahead for any movie I mention here, so if you don't want anything spoiled, I highly suggest you skip over that section or just click away when that part comes. This will be your one and only warning. Alright, so if you want my personal opinion on knowing how to use ambiguity, and keep in mind I don't claim to be an expert on this matter, the trick is to never present a question to your audience that you don't have an answer to. From there, you simply have to know how many of those questions you intend on answering within the narrative and when you're going to reveal those answers. Now, that first part in particular is very important, to the point that it's almost writing 101. Never throw a question out there that you yourself don't have the answer to, because that never works, and your audience will always be disappointed by any answer you end up giving them. Especially because without knowing the answer, you can't properly foreshadow it within the story, which is another must of storytelling and something your audience will be looking for. So without foreshadowing or hinting at the answer, they'll inevitably pick up on the wrong things as clues and end up coming up with answers that are frankly much better than anything you can present in story. In fact, this happens all the time, and I can give you just one example of somebody who's done that one too many times for most people's liking. J.J. Abrams. Famous for his mystery box approach, Abrams always starts out his story strong by presenting a mysterious question and makes the audience hunger for the answer. The problem is, however, he never has an answer to the questions he's presenting. His tactic is to just come up with a question to get the audience as hooked as possible. Then, after a while, once the audience starts to tire of his stalling, he scrambles for some kind of answer and ends up coming up with something very underwhelming, and then has to over-explain it in order to cover up all the inconsistencies that answer ends up making to the story as well, with probably one of the most famous examples of this being the TV show Lost, but it usually ends up happening to some degree in everything he works on. Now, as I said before, this tactic of presenting a question right at the beginning to get the audience invested is known as a mystery box. Because in short, you're giving the audience a box and then make them want to know what's in it as much as possible. Unfortunately, as many have learned, when it comes to Abrams, there's never anything inside the box. And as I said before, the first thing you should figure out after the question is the answer, if not even come up with the answer first. That's how important it is. And that's why Abrams' stories never work in the long run. The ambiguity ends up falling flat when the audience realizes even the writers don't have an answer to what's going on. Because another key component to ambiguity is the idea that there is an answer to everything being presented, even if it's not a clear one or may even be impossible to actually figure out. But nonetheless, that one still exists, even if the writers themselves are the only ones to know it. And the best example I can give is an absolute master of ambiguity, Stanley Kubrick. Think about it. 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Shining, Eyes Wide Shut. This man knew how to keep his audience guessing in ways Abrams could only dream of. Because no matter how confusing his movies get, No matter how little is revealed in them, it always feels like there's an answer to them lurking around every corner, even if it's only one Kubrick himself fully understood. And The Shining in particular, there's so many confusing elements in it, and yet it still feels like it all fits together somehow. Even supposed inconsistencies feel as though they're completely intentional and fit in, such as Wendy claiming Jack broke Danny's arm 6 months ago when Jack later said it was 3 years ago, claiming he had been on the wagon for 5 months when it should be 6 at that point, and the previous caretaker being referred to as Charles Grady, but later identifying himself as Delbert Grady. In any other movie, people would be complaining about blatant script errors, but in this case, it only adds to the mystery because most people know that Kubrick likely did that on purpose. Especially because the movie is so creepy and confusing that stuff like that only adds to it and fits right in with the tone. But even on a more fundamental level, things like the woman in 237, the man in the bear costume, the final picture, and even if the ghosts existed in the first place, this man doesn't definitively answer anything. And it's absolutely brilliant because you know there's an answer somewhere. It's just a matter of finding it. And for over 40 years, scholars, critics, and even plain old regular people have been trying to find it to seemingly no success. But at no point does it ever occur to them that there might not even be an answer, because the movie is so well done that it's obvious there is one. It's just very well hidden. And the same goes for Kubrick's other movies as well. And tellingly, people who admire and take after Kubrick also tend to handle ambiguity very well, such as people like John Carpenter or Christopher Nolan. When those people choose to keep something ambiguous, they keep people guessing for weeks as to potential answers, just like Kubrick. But at the same time, there is such a thing as keeping things too ambiguous, or doing ambiguity just for ambiguity's sake. And I believe a good example of that is the 1943 horror movie I Walked with a Zombie. Now, critically acclaimed as it is, I feel this is a movie that leaves too many questions unanswered to the point that it feels like there are no answers. I mean, for the most part, the movie manages to balance questions and answers pretty well. But come the ending and stuff just happens. The characters just start doing things seemingly without aim or purpose, and none of it is ever given any context. Then it just ends and you're left wondering what the heck you just saw, why the characters did what they did, and wondering what happened afterwards. And those are all things The Shining avoids. Sure, you're left confused, but not because it felt like the plot fell apart. You always, for the most part, understand the characters' actions, and at least for the still living characters, you have an idea of what will happen to them next. In other words, what I'm getting at here is a good movie that's heavy on ambiguity is either like 2001, A Space Odyssey, basically a complete mind screw, or The Shining, which at least somewhat keeps things consistent on a fundamental storytelling level so that you're only confused about the things Kubrick wants you to be confused about. Trying to combine those two, however, almost never works and will inevitably leave the audience angry that everything feels too vague. Now, to touch on something I had mentioned earlier, I had also noted that knowing what questions to answer is very important. So let's say you're telling a more conventional story, but you're left stumped as to which questions you should answer within the plot. Well, I feel a good example to use as a template would be Pulp Fiction. And yes, I know its nonlinear plot can be confusing, but that's not what I'm referring to here. What I'm talking about is that Quentin Tarantino answers most of the questions he gives the audience and presents it to them at the appropriate times. For example, he doesn't just imply what the rapists were doing. He outright shows it to the audience so they know in no uncertain terms what would have happened to Marcellus had Butch not come back. However, there are two questions he chooses not to answer, the first being the wolf. Now, based solely off how Jules talks about him and his introduction, you immediately get the idea that this man means business and can handle any situation with ease, and is a little later on shown to be very persuasive. And thus, you immediately start wondering what he'd do in a very serious situation and how he'd handle it. But the thing is, you never get to see that. He easily gets the car to the chop shop and then he's just on his way. You don't find out much about him or what he'd do in a real situation, but your imagination starts running away from you, speculating what he would do if such a thing were to arise. And secondly is, of course, what's in the suitcase. You never get to see or get any indication as to what it contains, but that hasn't stopped people from putting forth their own theories as to what was in there, up to and including Marcellus's soul. Though, personally, I think that one's overdoing it a tiny bit. Now, my point here is, both of those questions being left unanswered was a very deliberate decision by Tarantino, and he even outright said as much when it comes to the suitcase. He felt the audience's imagination could come up with something more amazing than anything he could come up with, and thus decided to just not reveal its contents, outright stating that it's whatever the audience wants it to be. And it's the exact same story with the wolf. What the audience can imagine him doing in any given situation is inevitably going to be a lot cooler than anything Tarantino could have him do on screen, and thus keeps him a mysterious figure whose every action only fans the flames of the audience's imagination. So by keeping these two aspects of the story ambiguous, he majorly enhances both of them, making them much more remarkable and memorable than they would have been if the metaphorical curtain would have been pulled back and everything about them would have been revealed. And case in point, when Tarantino allowed the wolf to appear on some commercials, many complained that they took away the mystique of the character. Okay, so to make a long story short, if you believe that leaving something ambiguous will help enhance that aspect and the story as a whole, it's probably a good idea to do it. But other than that, and again, this is only my personal recommendation, I would make sure that questions are answered as long as they make sense and properly fit into the story. If they don't, then by all means don't answer them. But jokes aside, the only other time I'd recommend not answering something is if it's not relevant to the story or would just bog it down by answering it. To use that same film as an example, Tarantino never reveals who keyed Vincent's car, but he doesn't have to. Who did it isn't that important, and showing that happen might even disrupt the narrative. And that's another thing a lot of people make mistakes on. Don't feel you have to answer everything. If your story is left better off by something not being answered, then sometimes you just have to do what's best for the story. And if you want to do something that's really heavy on the ambiguity, then as I said before, either take the 2001 A Space Odyssey approach or the Shining's approach. I really don't think there's a better way to put it. And above all, never go the mystery box approach unless you are absolutely 1000% sure you know exactly what's in that box before you ever start writing a word of your story. Otherwise, you're dooming the whole thing from the start, as Abrams has proved many times. But if you're still left wondering what you should and shouldn't answer in your story, then all I can really say is trust your instincts. A good writer is one who knows exactly when, where, and which questions they should answer in any given story. Okay, that pretty much wraps this video up. So now it's your turn to tell me. Do you like it when movies are very ambiguous, or do you prefer a more straightforward narrative? Please feel free to let me know in the comments. And listen, if you're still confused and want to ask me a question on this topic, please feel free to ask in the comments as well. And remember, just like always, you are free to disagree with my opinions. We are only here to have a conversation, nothing more. And thank you all for watching. It is all greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.